Hey y'all, this is Brown at IF Brown, and as part of my ongoing coverage of Essential X-Men Volume 7, today we are going to be talking about Annual number 11. So this particular bad boy came out in 1987, and it was written by Chris Claremont and illustrated by penciler Alan Davis and inker Paul Neary. So on the cover here, you've got the alien menace known as Horde, and then you have Storm, Wolverine, and this metallic figure who is actually Psylocke, and it makes sense in context of the story. And then you have in the corner here, you got Dazzler, and you got Longshot, and you have guest stars Captain Britain and Meggan, and then you have Havoc, and last but not least, Rogue. So the title of this particular annual is called Lost in the Funhouse. And it's a pretty good standalone story. And this is the character Horde's introduction to the X-Men series. And as far as I know, at least based on the X-Men stories I've read past this point, I haven't actually seen Horde turn up again, but then again, he might have turned up in some stories I haven't read yet. So, but this is his introduction to the X-Men series. And it's a pretty good story in the sense that even though it's a standalone story, it continues the tradition of Chris Claremont and his creative team working together to continuing to flesh out and further develop the X-Men as characters and as a team, and also just creating an awesome story all around, in the sense that it starts off on Earth and then it ends up in another galaxy. So I mean, all in the span of a single story. So a lot happens in this issue, but it's one of those things where, I mean, you don't necessarily have to have read, a crap ton of X-Men stories to understand what's going on. I mean, a lot of it's self-contained, but although if you have been reading the X-Men series up to this point, it kind of goes, right, in, it fits rather well, within what's been going on, especially with what's been happening with the X-Men, as characters, including the veteran members, as well as the, quote unquote, fresh faces that have newly arrived to the team. But I enjoyed this issue, and I think that another bonus, about it for us X-Men fans is the fact that this is the first time in quite a few issues that the entirety of the current X-Men team is all together at the mansion, with the exception of Magneto, who I'm assuming at this point is occupied with mentoring the New Mutants. But for a while we've had, say, half the team be with the injured team members, as well as the few surviving Morlocks at Moira McTaggart's medical facility on Muir Island. And then you also had some of the X-Men remaining stateside, but this is the first time in a bit that everyone's on this newly put together team is in one place at the same time. And so it actually kicks off with the character of Wolverine after a night on the town, returning to the mansion, and singing rather badly, and it's pretty clear he's made his way through a couple of six-packs. And so while he's drunk by normal standards, I mean, by his standards, he hasn't even gotten started yet, and so his singing and stumbling around wakes up the rest of the X-Men that were trying to sleep, and they're all like, "Hey dude, you okay? What's going on? What are you doing?" and all this stuff. I mean, and some of them are kind of amused by his antics, but a couple of the others are concerned, because they're saying that yeah, you're a tough guy and everything, and yeah, but you're drinking a lot. I mean, what's going on? And Wolverine explains to a couple of them, namely and more specifically, he explains to Havoc that the way his healing factor works, it neutralizes poisons and diseases, and basically keeps him from getting the worst of it. And so since alcohol is a poison, his healing factor basically takes the edge off of it the minute he starts drinking. And so I mean, that's why he has a hard time getting drunk. And so while him being drunk by our standards is one thing, him being drunk enough to satisfy himself is an ever frustrating process for him. And as he says to Havoc, that's more of an explanation than he's ever given anyone about, his healing factor and, alcohol and what have you. And so, Storm basically, checks to make sure he's okay, and then lets him go on his way. And the rest of the X-Men are asking her, hey, what's going on, is he all right? And she's telling them that Wolverine is basically someone who is capable of judging how strong or how weak he is, and how he can whether or not he can handle something. And so basically just let him sleep it off, and he'll be right as rain the next morning. And I'm paraphrasing here, but in the meantime, though, there are a couple of guests, namely Psylocke's brother, Brian Braddock, aka Captain Britain, and his wife Meggan. And the two of them were basically more or less family for Betsy Braddock. And they've come to check in on her and see how she's doing, because they it was under their it was on their watch that Betsy Braddock came to Xavier's school for gifted youngsters, basically to try and recover from her ordeals that she had suffered, both prior to her coming stateside, as well as when she was shanghaied by Mojo, and ended up being an unwitting pawn of his. And so in the meantime, though, I mean, she was pointing out that she came to Xavier's school to rest and try and process things, but instead she came right as the mutant massacre was happening, which thrust her right into the middle of a war zone. And she's confiding in Brian, her brother, that she doesn't know if she is a born fighter like some of the X-Men are, or if she's someone who is going to have to fight out of strict necessity, like say Dazzler and Havoc, in the sense that Dazzler really had no choice in the matter, and Havoc, I mean, events that were outside his control have put him with the team as well, whereas people like Wolverine and Storm are born fighters. And so she's trying to find her place with the team, and which side that she's going to fall in. Is she a born fighter, or is she someone who is going to be fighting out of necessity, even if she doesn't really share the team dream, so to speak. And so Brian's pretty assuring for her, and telling her that, hey, you'll figure things out, blah blah blah. So then in the meantime, though, Wolverine, after he's recovered a little bit from his alcoholic escapades, he's come to his room, and the reason he's so depressed, though, is because this is actually the anniversary of the wedding that never was between him and his beloved Mariko. And the two of them were supposed to be married like a year or so ago, but then it turns out that there were events that were outside of their control, namely the villain Mastermind came in and turned Mariko against Wolverine and the X-Men for a time, but then even after they defeated Mastermind, Mariko basically confessed to Wolverine that the whole thing made her realize that she felt herself to be unworthy of Wolverine, because Wolverine had proven his love to her time and again. I mean, you read his miniseries, the one written by Chris Claremont and illustrated by Frank Miller. I mean, you definitely see how Wolverine fought tooth and nail to be worthy of her. And so after all that, Mariko feels that she's actually unworthy of him, partially because the fact that she was so easily manipulated by Mastermind, but also because of her family's ties to the Japanese criminal underworld. which granted is more, her father's fault than anyone's. But, even though Wolverine had, slain her, father in combat, she's now in charge of that, criminal underworld, even though it's a responsibility she wishes she could relinquish. But until she's able to be rid of it entirely, she basically, confessed to Wolverine that, the two of them, they can't be together until this part of her life is over, just until this chapter is closed. And so, Wolverine, he's thinking to himself that, time was, he would just, said, screw it, screw the rules, screw honor, screw duty, I'm taking you and we're getting out of here, and damn the consequences. I mean, that's what Wolverine would have done. Wolverine, the fighter, the berserker, the animal, the beast. But, ever since, his, showdown with Shingen, as well as his, continuing, time with the X-Men team, he's come to, grow further as a man, as Logan. And so as a man, the only thing he could do was accept her decision and, promise to be there for her whenever she was ready for, to be with him once more. And so, and trust that she would be ready to be with him once more, once this part of her life was done. And so it was a very difficult decision for him to make, needless to say. And, that's the reason why he's, so plastered on this particular evening, because this was what would have been the, anniversary of their wedding. But unfortunately, said wedding never happened. So in the meantime, though, Storm, after conversing with some of the other X-Men, just about what's been going on lately, and also what's been going on with Wolverine as well, she, heads up to the attic, where she keeps her plants, and, she goes there to sort of, blow off some steam and, relax and, calm down, and sometimes meditate even. But unfortunately, she finds herself under attack by this alien menace known as Horde. And so, the X-Men, they try to, once Psylocke, is able to, detect that Storm is under attack, she gives a signal, a telepathic signal, and alerts them all to, be ready to fight, and, tells them to head to, Storm's room in the attic. And Rogue, who at this point had been in the hangar, working on the X-Men's, plane, she immediately comes, flying, from, the hangar, to the mansion itself. And unfortunately, though, is made short work of by, this, new menace, Horde. And so the rest of the X-Men, as well as Captain Britain and Meggan, I keep, calling her, I keep wanting to call her Magic for some reason, maybe because she's, blonde like the character Magic is. But anyway, Captain Britain, Meggan, and Rogue had all three tried to attack Horde at once, but they were defeated very easily and off panel, to add insult to injury. And Havoc and Dazzler were actually, taken out by Wolverine, because what ended up happening was, Wolverine, once he heard all the ruckus, he came running, but he's still, sobering up, and he's not quite, 100% alert just yet. And he accidentally, crashes into Dazzler and Havoc, and, his body, having an adamantium laced skeleton plus his claws being extended, he nearly kills them. And so they're calling him out on it, and, he's, running and apologizing at the same time. But then, he ends up, charging into, where the, chaos is, and ends up getting, chunked right back, where he came, back the way he came, and into, Dazzler and Havoc, and knocking them both out. And so then Longshot, he hears that there's the silence has come in and just replaced all the chaos. And so he's like, is the fight over? But unfortunately for him, no, it's not. And that's when Horde, bursts through a wall that was right behind Longshot and incapacitates him as well. And so the last one standing ends up being Psylocke. And, Horde is, demanding that Psylocke, surrender, and he'll spare her comrades. And so she's thinking to herself, here she was, talking to her brother earlier about, she doesn't know whether she's a born fighter or if she's someone who's going to be fighting out of necessity. And then she's thinking to herself, I could try and run, but that's going to be pointless, especially if, he's holding the lives of my teammates in his hands. I mean, who's to say that, that's not going to frustrate him into, killing them, as well as, who's to say that I could even escape him if I tried? And so she reluctantly surrenders to Horde. And at that point, he takes her in with the rest of her teammates and teleports them across the galaxy and to this other planet that they've never been to before. And he introduces himself as much like them, he too is a mutant, albeit amongst his own kind. And he has the ability, amongst other things, to basically read and know his foes better than they know themselves. And also he's been helped by this alien crystal that is embedded in his head, and it's a part of him at this point. But he's conquered multiple worlds, and he's anytime he set his mind to something, anyone who's tried to stop him has been utterly defeated, and their worlds have been wiped out. And so he's threatening the same fate to the X-Men unless they do what he wants them to do. In this case, he needs them to act as his pawns in obtaining this crystal that is on a sort of universal level of power. And it's something that's been sought after by many over hundreds of years. And he himself has been pursuing it for some time as well. But with the X-Men, he feels like he actually has a chance of obtaining it. And they're asking him, well, okay, if you're so powerful, if you're powerful enough to defeat us, why do you even need us? I mean, why can't you do it yourself? And he brushes them off, saying that it's why is it even necessary for me to get my hands dirty when I can have other people do my dirty work? And so basically, he's a bully, albeit one who has killed millions of people, as well as destroyed many worlds, in his time as a conqueror. And so the X-Men confer amongst themselves, and he had actually given them a chance to try and take him on in a quote-unquote fair fight. He had used his powers to basically restore them all to their fully physically healthy states, to where it's like they're all fresh and ready to go. And so each one of them, with the exception of Storm, who holds back for some reason, takes Horde on and uses their powers to the utmost of their capabilities. And ordinarily something like that would have left a foe utterly defeated, if not outright killed. And the X-Men, once they kind of come to their senses, they realize that they've just killed someone out of pure anger. And then Horde just reappears and just starts laughing, and he's asking them what's more frustrating, the fact that that you guys gave in to your impulses and to try and kill me, or the fact that you couldn't kill me. And Storm, she knew that this was some kind of test or some kind of trick on his part, which is why she held back. And plus the fact that she doesn't have any powers other than her own physical capabilities at this point. And so since Horde has proven himself, capable of defeating the X-Men twice in the same evening, they reluctantly, decide to, go along with what he's wanting them to do, and namely to steal this crystal. And so, once they arrive, at the fortress where the crystal is held, they see this line of statues, that's, guarding, guarding the entrance. There's a series of statues on one side and a series of statues on the other, and basically all facing the middle. And Havoc's pointing out that he recognizes a couple of the statues, namely the Kree and Skrull like two members of the Kree and Skrulls. And so basically he's like, okay, I don't know who these people are, but I recognize a couple of the races here. So this place must have been here a long time, but I don't know why all these other races have been I guess recognized or visualized here. Are they supposed to be symbolic guardians? And he doesn't really know, but he's remembering stuff from the records that the X-Men have, and the X-Men can't explain it any more than he can. So as they as they head to the entrance, Longshot actually holds back, and their X-Men are like, hey, what's wrong? I mean, why aren't you coming with us? And he admits that he doesn't want to. He said that his legs aren't letting him, and his hearts in turn aren't letting his legs let him. So basically he's scared of this place on an almost primal level for some reason, and he can't explain why. And so Dazzler, the one who's arguably become the closest to him, persuades him to join them and explains that, hey, if you think we're not scared, I mean, trust me, we are. So you don't have to be alone here, and you won't be alone. Just come with us, and we can get through this thing together. And so Longshot, reluctantly, goes along with it, but he's remembering, it's like, hey, these are my friends, I need to be there for them. Because I mean, even though like he is suffering from amnesia and everything, he does know that the X-Men are his friends, and he wants to be there for them, and especially Dazzler, who he's become really close with. And so when she says that she needs him, he's there. And so once he gets through the entrance, this door comes crashing down, basically sealing the X-Men off from the outside world. And Havoc, for one, tries to blast his way out, but nothing happens. And basically the cosmic radiation that he's able to shoot out from his hands and everything from his body, I mean, should have been enough to easily melt through this door, regardless of how thick it is. But there's barely a scratch. And Brian Braddock, aka Captain Britain, is kind of a bit of a scientist, and he's fascinated by Havoc's capabilities, and he's thinking to himself that it'd be a fascinating opportunity to be able to study Havoc's body, to understand how his mutation works, like how he's able to absorb all this cosmic and solar radiation and then just give it right back. But obviously now's not the time. But seeing it in action, though, was a bit of a learning opportunity, as was the fact that regardless of how powerful all that stuff was, it had no effect whatsoever on the door, on the barrier that's keeping them there. So whatever the stuff's made of is beyond their experience and their capabilities. And so they decide to go ahead and head on through. And Wolverine volunteers to scout ahead, basically kind of using his senses and hunter instincts to try and find his way to the crystal. and make sure, the way ahead is clear, because, Psylocke's, not detecting anything in the way of life forms, and Wolverine's not detecting anything in the way of, like living people either. But I mean, Wolverine's definitely detecting a lot of dead bodies. And so, sure enough, as he goes on ahead, the X-Men come across like countless skeletons of, other races, like members of other races that have, come by over the years, and presumably, tried doing the same thing. But one by one, this fortress, that's contained the crystal, seems to be working against the X-Men by basically trapping each one of them individually, in a sort of wish fulfillment fantasy, almost like a Lotus Eater, machine trap. The first to fall is Rogue, because she's with the X-Men, but suddenly she hears sounds like from a party, and so she follows the sounds, and she finds herself outside the window of this house, from long back in the day, like say in the 1800s, like a southern plantation, and she sees herself, as a Southern belle at this party on the inside of the house, and she's kind of the life of the party. Everyone's laughing and having a good time, and she's able to touch people. And this is something that she has been incapable of doing since she was a kid. And she's seeing herself having this life that she never got to have but always dreamed about. And she initially tries to snap herself out of it, but then when she sees this other dream form of her reach out, and her hand, she takes it, and her dream form kind of pulls her in, and next thing she knows, she's wearing the same Southern belle outfit that her dream form was, this nice dress and everything, and all the men are fawning over her and wanting to dance with her and all that. And she basically has found a place of romantic acceptance, because of the way she'd always romanticized the Old South and what have you. Much like, say, some people romanticized things like Camelot, and that's kind of the similarities in her mind. But here she is being sought after and wanted and accepted, and she basically surrenders to the fantasy. And so when the X-Men find her, Psylocke is pointing out that she has always had a difficult time reading Rogue's mind, because some of her patterns or thought patterns are actually alien in nature because of her of the Kree connections of Miss Marvel, whose consciousness she absorbed. And so she's always had a hard time reading Rogue's mind, but she was able to pick up enough of surface activity to be able to tell the X-Men roughly what happened, that Rogue was basically given her heart's desire and saw little reason to resist. And so as soon as she tells the X-Men this, Rogue's body just crumbles to dust. And so they're all like, okay, well, no wonder this place is such a challenge, because I mean, what other what more defense do you need other than to offer someone their heart's desire and actually give it to them? And so, like, who would want to fight back against that? And so one by one the X-Men are taken out in one way or another. In some ways, I mean, like, you have Havoc, who basically has been struggling with feeling inadequate in comparison to his brother this whole time, and also just has been holding in the frustration that he's been feeling with having to constantly keep his powers in check every second of every day, and how to be careful, having to be careful and everything. And he just with as out of control as his life has been, he just wants to lash out and let it all go. And so Brian, Captain Britain, is trying to calm him down and say, hey, you need to use your powers responsibly here. You can't just go off half cocked, so to speak. But then Havoc just lashes out at him and says, who the hell are you to tell me what to do? And I mean, you don't know me. I mean, you don't know what I've struggled with, and you don't know how long I've had to keep this reined in. And so the angrier he's getting, the more intense his power is getting, and he starts, lighting up like a sun. And the X-Men are, telling him to power down because he's starting to burn them. But instead, he just keeps going, and he becomes like a miniature sun, and the whole place is engulfed in solar radiation, and he becomes a star. But then, it comes back to reality, and once the light has died down, the X-Men, see that Havoc has become a statue, and they come to realize that he just, in a way, got what he wanted too. He just had a chance to let it all go, and he gave into it, and so now he too is at one with the fortress, and then Longshot finds himself actually becoming transparent and almost like a ghost. And he's telling the X-Men that he feels the fortress calling to him. He says that the fortress wants me to be a part of it, not like you guys aren't a part of it. It sees me as the same. And then he sort of grows into this ghostly giant before merging with the fortress itself, and his voice basically fades away. And this kind of drives Dazzler crazy, because with guilt, because she's the one who tried to persuade Longshot to come with them, even though he had no desire to go into the fortress with them, because on some level he felt there was something wrong with it, and that it wasn't going to end well for him. Basically, he didn't know what the fortress was, but he could feel it in his bones that he and the fortress couldn't exist at the same time, on some level. And so, as at least as far as he could, that's the best he could explain it. And so, the X-Men are trying to figure out, okay, well, why did it do that to Longshot? Because Rogue and Havoc, we can understand, but Longshot literally just faded away, and he says he became a part of it. And they're wondering if maybe it's because of his innate innocent nature, because all the X-Men have hopes and dreams, and their own inner demons and what have you, whereas Longshot, as far as they know, he just wants to help them. He just wants to fit in and what have you, and maybe because of his amnesia and everything, any goals he once had are no longer a part of him. And so maybe with that in mind, all that's left is the innocence that he has, along with his luck power. And maybe this alien fortress, it couldn't stand for that. It couldn't stand for the fact that someone was inside of it that had no hidden goals or private desires. And so basically it envied Longshot in some way, and so it absorbed him to make his innocence a part of it or something. They're doing mass guessing at this point. But at this point, Dazzler runs away from the team, because she's blaming herself for his apparent death. And Psylocke, she reaches out to her telepathically and tries to get her to calm down. And Dazzler apologizes, saying that you guys must consider me a total loser here. And Psylocke saying, no, you're stronger than you give yourself credit for, and there's a reason you're part of the team. And so just trying to reassure her. But at that point, Dazzler, who's using her light sound and light powers to light the way, her light goes out, and she's trying to figure out, okay, what's this fortress going to hit me with? And the next thing she knows, she's being, shown three different versions of herself. She's being shown a version of herself that, did what her father wanted her to do, namely become a lawyer, and then, what a successful, and non-corrupt judge. And going from there, she sees herself as, a singer, because, even though her father wanted her to be a lawyer or a judge, she herself always wanted to be a singer, and she always clashed with her father on that. But she's gained the adoration of millions. But then, she's, thinking, well, wait a minute, I've tried being a singer before, and look what happened to me. My life was turned upside down. My admirers now hate me, and because I'm a mutant, and so she's like, what's the point of even trying anymore? If every time I try, I just have the world blow up in my face. And so she's thinking, well, wait a minute, what if I don't even have to try? What if I don't even have to bother, reaching for the brass handle or the brass ring, and just coming within inches and missing, because that's what she kind of feels like her life has been, constantly reaching for the brass ring, but always missing. And so she sees herself as a vagrant, not really caring about anything, wandering through life with no hopes and no dreams. And so with everything that's gone wrong in her life lately, and plus the fact that she's blaming herself for Longshot's apparent death, she gives in, and sort of follows the path of, the drifting vagrant. And so at that point, she too disappears, and the remaining, members of the team, they figure, okay, we can't go after her, because if we do, the fortress is going to, turn another one of us away, and we'll be, shy a few less people, and we're already a dwindling party here. And so, but then, it comes down to, Psylocke, Captain Britain, Meggan, and Storm. And as far as they can tell, as far as Psylocke can tell, Wolverine's still ahead of them, and somehow is, still going, like he's still following a trail. But, then what ends up happening is Captain Britain and Meggan, end up being confronted with a vision of themselves having a, happy life, together, raising a family. And, Meggan is wanting to stay and be a part of it, and have that life. And Captain Britain is wanting to, is trying to resist and saying, what right do I have to give in to that when, the lives of others depend on us? But then, Psylocke turns around, and she tears off her flesh and reveals herself as a sort of metallic, figure, because she explains that, she knows what she is now. She was trying to figure out before if she was a born fighter or if she was someone who was fighting out of necessity. And, she's something in between. And, her whole, the whole of her experiences has basically tempered her into this unfeeling, figure, and it's now being externalized. And so this basically horrifies both her brother and Meggan. And so the two of them, in terror, retreat into their, personal fantasy of having a family together. And, Psylocke basically, gives them her blessing and says that she understands, them, and she envies them as well. And so at this point, it's now down to her and Storm and Wolverine, who's somewhere in front of them, a long ways away. But, they did notice, though, that, prior to, Captain Britain and Meggan finding their fantasy and giving into it, they'd been able to smash through some of the walls when ordinarily they wouldn't be capable of doing so, because earlier when they had tried to, nothing would happen. But ever since the fortress absorbed Longshot, they're theorizing that, his innate good luck, must have been, working against the fortress and in the X-Men's favor, which explains why they were able to smash through the walls like they were. But unfortunately, in the process, they came across a chamber that had Brian and Meggan's fantasy. So, but the good news is, they've made progress in being able to track the crystal, because Psylocke has actually been able to get a reading on the crystal this whole time. It's just like this alien voice, but the fortress keeps on making obstacles for them. But it wasn't until it had absorbed Longshot that the X-Men had been able to start smashing through the walls. And so in the meantime, though, Psylocke is warning Storm that while she senses Wolverine making his way closer to the crystal, she also senses Horde now making his way into the fortress, because he can tell that the X-Men are almost upon the crystal, and he's not even bothering to hide his hide himself from them. And so she tells Storm to follow Wolverine's trail, and she points Storm in the right direction and tells Storm that she will do whatever she can to buy her and Wolverine some time. And so she heads off to confront Horde. And so Storm, unfortunately though, is caught up in a fantasy of her own, namely with the woman Yukio, who was a friend / lover of Wolverine, but whom she had also met during the whole affair with Mastermind. And so she and Yukio had become really good friends, and she had sort of given Storm a sort of joy for living again, and sort of dancing on the edge of madness as a thief and what have you. And so she's basically caught up in this fantasy of not having to live a life of responsibility, but just living a life of flirting with danger on a daily basis and glorifying in it. And so she's having to fight tooth and nail to come back to reality. But when she reemerges, she's still dressed like she was in this fantasy, and like a thief, like an exotic thief, like Yukio was. And at that point, that's when she comes across Wolverine, who at this point had smashed through the skylight, and the two of them, it turns out, are now in the chamber where the crystal's located. And so it turns out is also where Horde is at this point. And he throws pieces of Psylocke's metal body at them, saying that she put up a good fight, but it was a futile one. And that's when Wolverine pushes Storm back into the chamber where she'd found her basically her fantasy, her dream life, and or her innermost desire being fulfilled. And Storm tries to protest against it, but once she's back in this this dream that's calling to her, she gives into it, because she put everything she had into fighting it back against it the first time, but she doesn't have enough inner strength to do it a second time. And so the way Wolverine figures it, if it's down to him to get to the crystal and he fails, at least Storm will basically be in a happy place, so to speak, and so will the rest of the X-Men, as far as he could tell. And it's just a matter of him being able to get to the crystal, and even if he doesn't, at least the X-Men won't know. But unfortunately for him, Horde impales him, and even though Wolverine's got his healing factor and everything, he's already been put through a lot, what with, tearing through this living structure to get to the crystal, and Horde impaling him and nearly tearing him in half. At that point, he sees, Wolverine still struggling, to get to the crystal, and he, picks Wolverine up and tells him that he has a courageous heart. And then he grows these claws and, rips it out of him, telling him that'll make a good trophy. And so at that point, while Wolverine's dying, his blood splashes on the crystal, and that is what serves to be, Horde's defeat. And so, the blood making contact with the crystal, it turns out, is enough, for Wolverine's essence to become a part of the crystal. And, his force of will and his, healing ability kind of, just being a part of his nature, was also enough for, I guess you could say, his spirit to, hold on. And what ends up happening is, the crystal, reforms him and brings him back to life. Even though his dead body's on the floor, he's reconstructed and reborn right in front of Horde. And, Horde, realizes now that, his, goals of trying to get the crystal are, ruined. And, he tries to, deny Wolverine this victory, but Wolverine, simply, takes, the crystal from his head. That turns out it was actually a part of this, crystal the whole time. And somehow Horde had gotten a hold of a piece a long time ago, but, and he's basically been, using this piece to augment his own powers and live a life of debauchery. But now, without it, his life of, sin and corruption are catching up to him. It has finally caught up to him, and he turns into a withered husk before Wolverine's eyes. But in the meantime, though, Wolverine's becoming one with this crystal and is becoming one with the universe, and he can feel all the life, throughout the universe, all the people, and, he can, if he wants to, he can easily fix so many problems. He can, give people honor and decency, and, he can force people to stop fighting. He can change people for the better. But then he starts to realize, well, wait a minute, this must have been what Jean Grey was feeling like when she became the Phoenix. And so, and then he thinks to himself that, the one thing he can't abide is, someone playing God with his life and soul. And so, how could he, in turn, do that to other people, let alone a whole universe? And so, as tempting as it is, he, turns the power down. And so at the same time, though, he also realizes that he can't just leave the crystal there, because even if he's able to walk away from it, other people will come for it. And so he does the one thing he can do. And he's thinking to himself, at least the X-Men, my fellow team members are, in a better place right now. And I wish there was another way, but even if this ends up killing them, at least they're dying happy, and so will I. Or basically, he'll die knowing that he ultimately did the right thing, the only thing he could do in the situation. Because if he doesn't, then he'll just give in to the desire to be a god, and he knows that it won't end well. And so he reluctantly destroys the crystal, and which in turn brings down the whole fortress, and it falls to pieces. And so then we come back to Earth, and all the X-Men find themselves, back in the mansion, albeit, dressed as they were in this, alien fortress, with the crystal. And so, that, for any of them that were thinking that it was just a crazy dream, they realize, no, something actually happened here. And so, they reconvene, in the hallways and are, questioning each other and like, what happened? And the best that they could figure is, well, since all of them had been, taken by the fortress, Wolverine must have done something, to restore order and, get them back to, where they were supposed to be. Um, and so, it's like they have the memories of the place, but they don't feel the crystal, calling to them anymore. And so they come to feel that, whatever happened, the crystal is no longer a threat, neither is Horde. And they go to check on Wolverine, and they see that, he's basically, in his room, with his samurai sword, with his back to the door, sort of standing guard, you know, of of them because, he's wanted to make sure that, as they come to, then that they're going to be okay. And so once they realize what he's doing, they decide to give him some peace and quiet and, back off because, they know what the fortress did to all of them. It took them in, by giving them their heart's desires. But, for Wolverine, you know, whatever it was that, it did to him must have been much worse because he clearly fought back against it. And what it had done, what they don't know, is that it had given him a chance to be with Mariko, to have the life he always wanted with her, but he had to turn it down twice, and he just was barely able to get through it a second time. But they don't know that though, but they just know that he paid a steep price to be able to, you know, get them back to where they were supposed to be. And so, and it ends with Storm, later on, in her attic, just basically reflecting on all this and, just wondering what this means for the X-Men, because as far as they know, this little story's over. But, as the narration goes on, what they don't know is that this crystal is basically, something that tests, species over the years. And, countless people have come, seeking the crystal, and Horde was but one of many. And so anyone who is able to get the crystal but have the, willpower to, refuse to use it, basically passes this test where not only do they survive, but whatever, species they are is given a chance to, further evolve on an evolutionary scale, over, hundreds of years. But basically, they succeed not just for themselves, but for their race as well. And so the X-Men don't know it, but they just did humanity a solid, by Wolverine, passing this test. And so, and it comes back to the statues that lined the entrance, to the fortress. And each one of the statues, it turns out, were once living beings and people that had, tried to, get the crystal themselves, and it actually succeeded. But whereas, Wolverine had, had the willpower to resist the crystal, these people had not. And so people like, say, when he's like the Kree and the Skrull that you see, amongst the group, basically they condemned their species to an evolutionary stagnation because they didn't have the willpower to resist. And so this day, the X-Men, gave humanity a big boost, but no one will ever know. So that's how that particular story ends. And like I said earlier at the start of this video, I thought it was a good standalone story, and I think that it does a good job of further developing the, X-Men as characters. And I liked seeing how, they have their, insecurities, prior to this adventure starting, and yet once they're inside the fortress and everything, they're, having all their, inner turmoils and inner desires turned against them. And in stories like this, it's always interesting seeing how, certain characters, react to such situations. And in a way, their thoughts and dreams, made sense, for each of them. I mean, you had Rogue, being offered a life of love and acceptance in a romanticized setting, and then you had, Dazzler, of course, being, you know, given, kind of a multiple choice, yeah, outcome, but it unfortunately, even though she chose the option that would have given her, the worst life, considering what's going on with her, it makes sense, the decision that she made, and plus, the added stress of, in her mind, accidentally, getting Longshot killed when she's really come to like. And I liked Longshot's, fate, because even though it seems random, the fact that the fortress, basically wanted him to be a part of it because it couldn't abide, someone or something within it not having, any sort of secret, goals or hidden desires or anything like that. Like, he was just pure innocence at that point. And yet that innocence, combined with that luck power, in a way, did help the X-Men in the long run, though, because it wasn't until he was absorbed into the fortress that the X-Men were literally able to start smashing through the walls, as Captain Britain found out. And so, even though like the story wasn't focused on any one particular character, like all the characters had a chance to shine. I like that little bit though. And so it's like, even someone who's, has a comparatively minor presence in the story, or seemingly minor presence in the story, has a big impact on the outcome of the story. And I kind of felt sorry for Havoc though, because I mean, he's someone that, especially with issue 219, I mean, where he, joins the team finally, or at least this new team under Chris Claremont's run. I mean, we've come to know him as a character, and we understand his insecurities and his inner, turmoil. And when we see what happens with him, like, how he just wants to just let go and just cut loose, I mean, without a care, for what happens as a consequence, it's like we understand it, and so, but we're also not surprised at the outcome of it, in the sense that, this is something he actually desires, and he just wants to let go. And so he, in a way, is at peace, albeit, now as a statue, at least until the story ends, Excuse me, sorry. But I don't know a whole lot about Captain Britain and Meggan. I know that Captain Britain is, Psylocke's brother, and, Meggan is his wife. But I also know that the two of them eventually, go on to be in the group Excalibur. But I thought they were a nice presence in the story because, their chemistry together, as husband and wife, was really nice to see. And, and it's like the chemistry's already there, the love's already there. And they both, clearly care about, Betsy. And there's even a nice little moment where, Betsy's talking with the both of them, but then, Meggan, she's still, sort of, I guess, learning about, the modern day world and its, wondrous technology. And she's, taken, by, a TV of all things. And she's, switching channels and in awe of all the stuff that she can watch. But while this is true for her, she's also using this as an opportunity to, give Brian and Betsy a chance to talk. So I like that little bit there, because I mean, Meggan is seemingly the, naive, newcomer, at least as far as, to the modern world, but at the same time, she's aware enough to know that, hey, these two people I care about need to talk. I'm going to give them some space. But, ooh, TV, So I like that little bit. And, Brian and Betsy both clearly care about each other. And even if you hadn't, read anything with either of them in it up to this point, just from the dialogue alone, you can tell that these two are close with each other. They have a connection. And you really buy the fact that they're a brother and sister that care about each other. And so that was nice to see. And also, I didn't know that Brian Braddock was a scientist. So, getting his thoughts on certain situations, like when he sees Havoc's power in action and how he's wanting to study it and everything, it makes sense. So it's like, as a scientist, I mean, you'd want to figure out, how does that work, But of course, him being a responsible individual, he realizes that, that has to take a, back seat to the well-being of the team, and his loved ones too. So I thought, they were neat guest stars. And of course, for, like, Wolverine and Storm, I mean, they continue to show why, they're kind of the team leaders. and it's understandable, why the two of them would last the longest against this fortress and its innermost desire and its capabilities of turning their innermost desires against them and trapping them in this sort of lotusy or fantasy. And it was interesting, seeing Storm's, dream fulfilled, basically a life on the edge, which, she got a, glimpse of with Yukio. And that was interesting. I mean, I don't know if anyone's pointed it out. I'm sure they have, but, Storm, for the most part, seems to have, a predominantly a predominant interest in men, romantically speaking. But here, though, if you want to read into it, there is an almost, romantic, subtext, between her and Yukio there, because, I mean, clearly Yukio and her are, very close friends and everything, but the way she describes her connection with Yukio, I mean, it almost sounds romantic at times. So it's like, that's, different. Didn't expect that. So that was interesting to see. But I also liked how, she's, in terms of, say, how she and the team initially try to go up against Horde. I like how she's the one who realizes that, okay, we can't do anything against him right now, but, obviously, he needs us to get something into Fortress. So it stands to reason that there's something in the Fortress that we can use to defeat him. But in order to do that, we have to go along with him for now. And so she's the one who, kind of, gets the team to go along with it, but she's able to, back it up with, a sound logic, And so, like, Wolverine at this point, I mean, yeah, he's also kind of team leader, but he's in an emotionally shaken state, because of, the fact that this is, the anniversary of the wedding with him and Muriko that never was, and so his head isn't all there, whereas Storm is able to kind of keep everyone focused. And so that was pretty cool to see, and it's another, good spot development for her character. As for Wolverine, though, I do like how initially he seems to be, the liability, a liability against the team, what with the fact that, he inadvertently almost kills, Dazzler and Havoc, just through pure clumsiness, and the fact that, he's got an adamantium-laced skeleton and his claws are extended, and then he's literally used by Horde to knock the two of them out, And so at first you're thinking, oh boy, this guy's not going to be of any use to the team. But then it turns out, he's the one who ends up, saving the day. And so I love that, that twist of irony there. Like, he starts off as the weakest, but at the end of the day, he's the one who ends up being the strongest, because not only does he, resist, the fantasy, that the crystal has for him twice, but he also is able to hold off the temptation of being a god. And the fact that he's able to do that once is awesome enough. But the fact that he's able to do it twice is even better, because he recognizes that, I mean, yes, it makes sense, for him to want to fix the universe, and that he has the power to do it, and he doesn't even know that it's a test at this point. But he also knows that, he could be doing all this with the best intentions, but in some way something's going to go wrong down the road, because, what right does he have to control, other people's lives, let alone a whole universe. And so, he's thinking, what would he want? What would he want, someone to do it, in that situation? Would he want someone to take charge of him and control him? Or would he want someone to, basically let him go and make his own decisions? And so, I liked seeing that inner conflict. So it's like the temptation was there, okay, which makes him all the more human. I mean, we'd all be tempted, I think. So if you had someone who was in that situation but was in no way tempted whatsoever, I mean, yeah, it'd be good for the heroes and everything, but it wouldn't be anywhere near as compelling as it would be, since we had Wolverine here, because Wolverine, I mean, he's a hero and everything. He's proven himself to be a hero, but at the end of the day, he is still human and he still is tempted, but he has the inner strength to, recognize it for, the problem that it could be, and how, the problems would outweigh the benefits in the long run, at least in his way of thinking. And so his actions make sense. When he destroys the crystal and in turn brings down the fortress, I mean, he has no way of knowing what's going to happen, but he feels on some level that it's the best thing for everyone. So he's playing God one way or the other, but here though, at least, he's not going to be, taking the universe by force of will. Here it's, he's just ending the threat, to the universe and keeping it from and keeping the crystal from falling into anyone else's hands. And of course, he has no way of knowing that this is one big test, but at the end of the day, though, his discernment, ended up literally being a lifesaver, because not only are the X-Men all sent back to Earth, and fully restored and everything, but they've unknowingly, given humanity a chance to evolve on an evolutionary scale over, hundreds of years. And so, yeah, Wolverine, definitely, comes through shining in this story. But all in all, though, I'm going to go ahead and give this story. Well, actually, no. Before I do that, before I give the rating, the one nitpick I could throw in that I could think of was that Magneto. Where was he in all this? I mean, the only thing I could think of is, he must be, taking care of the New Mutants on some adventure at some point, because, this being the X-Mansion, the New Mutants are usually there as well as the X-Men, but here, there's no sign of them. So the only thing I'm thinking is, Magneto, must have been, minding the New Mutants on some adventure outside of the mansion or something like that. So I'm not sure what was going on with the New Mutants series at this point. But considering that Magneto had such a memorable presence in, the prior story, in issue 219, where, Havoc becomes part of the team, I mean, he had a very memorable, part in the story. And so the fact that he's absent here was kind of disappointing. So I think, even if he hadn't been there, if maybe there'd been a little bit of dialogue clarifying, where he is at this point, like if he was indeed with the New Mutants on some adventure of theirs, maybe if, the X-Men, some of the X-Men were talking about things and it came up in conversation, that would at least, clarified, where he was and why he wasn't in the story. But still, though, even if that had been the case, I mean, that would have cleared things up, but I still missed him, in this story, the nature of the threat and everything. I was wondering, well, how would he do against Horde? Where the X-Men failed. I mean, he's a guy who has, either nearly defeated the X-Men on more than one occasion or has defeated the X-Men on more than one occasion. And so, I mean, yeah, they're frenemies now, or they're more friends than enemies now, since he's like literally the, headmaster of the school and everything. But, it would have been interesting to not only see him go up against Horde, because I'm wondering, okay, would he have been able to, defeat Horde? I mean, considering how powerful he is, and with him being a master of magnetism, and he could do so much, with his powers, as has been proven, and many issues with him, you know. But then again, I mean, would Horde have been able to easily defeat him as well? Because all the other X-Men were pretty powerful too. But, you know, I mean, then again, Magneto arguably had the most in terms of, say, experience and maturity, you know. And so I'm wondering, like, would he have been able to defeat Horde? Or at the very least, you know, given Horde a good run for his money by himself? Or could he, working with the X-Men, have defeated Horde? You know, but then again, if that happened, I mean, we would need some other way to get them to this, you know, fortress with the crystal. And so, considering that possibility, I mean, let's say, you know, Magneto had been in the story and had given the Horde a good run for his money, but then Horde found some way to, you know, defeat him, just maybe not quite as easily as the rest of the X-Men. You know, like having Magneto be a part of things and maybe have him be one of the, you know, victims of the fortress, you know, albeit one who lasted longer. Like, say, maybe if he had lasted as long as, like, Storm and Wolverine and Psylocke, you know, like, because he has an incredibly strong willpower. And so it would have been interesting, like, seeing him trying to, you know, help keep the rest of the X-Men together and encourage them and everything, and, you know, them sort of still distrusting him, but, you know, him trying to prove himself to them and be, you know, a source of hope and inspiration. And yet, you know, they're, you know, falling one by one, and then he's one of the, you know, last few left standing, and then he's confronted with his fantasy or his innermost desires. I mean, and considering his history, you know, that would have been very fascinating to see. And so, you know, I still think this is a great story, but I just think that it would have been better had Magneto been involved in the story or been a part of things. So, so I still love the story. I still think it's, you know, a wonderful, you know, bit of character development for all the team members. But it just, I think it would have been, like, it was awesome, but in the words of Jeremy Johns, it would have been awesome-tacular if Magneto had been a part of it. So his, you know, presence was missed. But nonetheless, this is still a great story. So I'm going to go ahead and give X-Men Annual 11, Lost in the Funhouse, 5 out of 5 stars. This is another solid, you know, hit for Chris Claremont and the creative team, especially, you know, with Alan Davis and Paul Neary working together. And, you know, it's definitely a wonderful standalone story, and yet one that goes along with, you know, further fleshing out, you know, the team. So I'll show you some of the artwork real quick before I depart. So here's Wolverine stumbling home and singing quite badly. And there he is, waking all the X-Men up and drinking in his own creative way, cutting the can in half and drinking what's left. And here he is explaining to Havoc, you know, how his healing, you know, factor, you know, keeps him from getting, you know, as drunk as he would like. Nice little, you know, group shot of the team there. I mean, I like how, I mean, you know, these are the X-Men, or at least the X-Men with a couple of guest stars, right? But I like how Alan Davis, you know, and Paul Neary are able to make them look like just ordinary people. I mean, that's something that Alan Davis has always been good with. Sometimes his artwork can be a little cartoony, but he still makes, you know, superheroes look like regular people. Well, I appreciate that. But here, they actually do look like people because they're in their PJs. There we are. And here's the bit where, you know, Betsy and Brian are talking, and, you know, Meggan, you know, kind of, you know, gives them a moment to be alone, and she uses her, you know, fascination with television as an excuse to let, you know, her husband and, you know, talk with, you know, his sister. But, you know, it's like, you know, the two of them talk, and, you know, Brian lets, you know, Betsy know that, you know, he's there for her, and You know, she's stronger than she thinks she is. And here we get Wolverine, you know, thinking and talking about, you know, how much, you know, he wanted to just, you know, take Mariko away from all her obligations, but, you know, him, you know, trying, you know, hard to actually be a man, you know, be the man that was worthy of her, you know, he had to step back and recognize that, you know, she made her choice and she needs to see it through. And so, solid bit of character development on Wolverine's part. Just, you know, it's kind of sad that, you know, things can't be the way he wants them to be, or he and Mariko want them, because they both want to be together. They both love each other. It's just, you know, they, you know, due to, excuse me, outside of, you know, factors, they can't really be together. So at least we understand why Wolverine's getting sloshed. And so this is where Horde makes his entrance, and Psylocke is, you know, signaling for the rest of the team to get ready to fight. And if you look right here, you can see her butterfly effect, and she's gotten in touch with Rogue. And so there's Rogue and Captain Britain and Meggan. And at first we were thinking surely the three of them would be able to take out whatever threat is waiting for them, you know, because they're all three pretty powerful. But then, nope. And so this is where Wolverine, you know, almost, you know, accidentally kills, you know, Dazzler and Havoc by stumbling into them. But then, you know, he ends up being, you know, used as a weapon against them and literally knocking them out. There's a long shot right there. Finding out the hard way, the fight's not over. And so then, you know, it's down to Psylocke. And here's Horde in all his glory. And I like how, you know, he's, you know, the way, you know, things are illustrated here. I mean, he's got the X-Men in some kind of stasis, but he makes them look like toys, you know, the way they're positioned, like chess pieces almost. And so here he is, you know, kind of explaining who he is, and he, you know, gives them, he recharges them, you know, restores them to their full strength and everything, and their uniforms. And here he is taunting them, telling them how, you know, each of their powers are useless against him. And in a way, I appreciate this a little bit, because it's a bit of his, you know, taunting of each one of them kind of adds to their character development in a way, because it's like an acknowledgement of their powers and everything, but how their power won't be, you know, the key to saving the day, you know, a bit of foreshadowing in a way. And I like how Dazzler is the one who, you know, makes the first strike in their second attempt to try and take him out, because, you know, she absorbs sound, you know, and then sends it back as, you know, light blasts. And so she's able to literally hit him with an eye blast here with her light. And here they are seemingly, you know, defeating Horde, and, you know, with Storm hanging back because she knows that this is too easy. And sure enough, yeah, it was a trick. And so, you know, Storm's all like, yeah, we gotta kind of have to go along with this for now. I love this shot right here. It's splash page. The alien of the Crystal Fortress. You see the statues here and there. But, and here they are, you know, reluctantly choosing to go in. And Storm kissing Wolverine for good luck. This is where, you know, Longshot is, you know, clearly terrified of going in, because he feels there's something wrong with it, just on a primal level. I mean, like, they're all scared, but he's scared just on a physical level. It's physically incapacitating. And once Dazzler persuades him to go in, that's when the door comes down, and this is where Havoc tries to burn through it, and Captain Britain's thinking how fascinating it would be to study his powers, but he can't do that right now. And so this is where Wolverine chooses to go off by himself to find the crystal on his own, ahead of them. And here's where Rogue gives into her fantasy as a Southern belle. And so here's how they find her. She's just kind of frozen in place with some tears of joy down her eyes, and then she just crumbles to dust. Right here, you got them going forward, but then you see Longshot freaking out because he sees his hand turning transparent, and then Havoc has his meltdown and just gives in to his desire to just let go, and he becomes like a star. He ends up becoming a statue right there. And so I like how it shows that he was starting to burn them, but then once he gave in completely, the fortress just turned him to a statue instead of him just inadvertently killing the X-Men. And this is where Dazzler sees Longshot becoming full on transparent, and he's saying that the fortress is calling him away. And he becomes a ghost and then just fades away. And Dazzler, of course, is guilt-stricken and runs away from the team. And Captain Britain's wanted to go after her, but Storm's like, no, because if we do that, how do we know that the fortress isn't going to, take you as well? So, leadership points for Storm. I like this, series of panels here because, it's like the lighting and the shadow, with, Dazzler and her light powers, and she's in a dark place, and, both emotionally and literally. But then I love this shot of Psylocke's butterfly effect, calming her down, and she's getting through to Dazzler, but that's when the fortress strikes. And here she is, as a lawyer, putting away the Kingpin and becoming a judge. And right here, you see her as a singer, and then as a vagrant. And she's at a point where she has to choose which way she wants to go. And because of all the stuff that's happened, she chooses the vagrant because she just doesn't want to, take risks and get hurt anymore. And so, this is where you kind of get the idea that Longshot's luck power, since he's been absorbed into the fortress, is starting to affect things because, Psylocke, once, Dazzler has been lost to him, she hits the wall in frustration, which literally brings the wall down. And they're all like, how the hell did she do that? And so that's when they're theorizing that Longshot's, luck power must be, working out in their favor against the fortress. But it's also, the moment where she realizes that she's starting to become changed as well. So it's sort of like Longshot's luck power plus the fortress is changing her too. So and so, with Captain Britain, kind of coming to a conclusion that the fortress is now starting to weaken on a physical level, he decides to try and get the X-Men, get the team closer to the chamber with the crystal. And so, he crashes through multiple walls. And so while it does get them closer to the chamber with the crystal, it also puts him and Meggan in the chamber or draws them to the chamber where their dreams are fulfilled. And here they are crashing into it, literally, and finding themselves as a happy, family with one baby and another on the way. And this is where Psylocke reveals that she's been transformed by the fortress. She really rips her skin off to reveal this sort of, mechanical body. A cold, unfeeling warrior. And so here's Wolverine, being confronted with his, dream being fulfilled of him, being with Mariko, united and married. And so it's like he fought back against it once, but then, he sees Mariko as a wilder version of herself. And he has to fight back against it again, and it nearly kills him, just emotionally speaking. But he ends up, falling through the ceiling. And this is where Storm ends up being taken into her dream, being fulfilled. Where she's reunited with her friend Yukio as a thief. But she's able to fight through it, and she and Wolverine are briefly reunited before Horde comes upon them and tosses the pieces of Psylocke at them. And Wolverine, in desperation, pushes Storm back into, her dream being fulfilled, so he can spare her the pain of, Horde's defeating them. And there he is, getting impaled by Horde. And I like how it makes it clear that Horde is ripping out Wolverine's heart, along with the artwork and narration, but they don't actually show it, though. You just get enough of an idea, but you see a blood flying and hitting the crystal, and then Wolverine being remade and reborn, and then taking, Horde's, power from him. I love this shot, or these shots, I should say, of Wolverine becoming one with the universe ever so briefly. So it's a nice bit of artwork, but it's also some really good character development on his part. He has all this power in his hands, but he has the maturity to not use it. And so he's resisted it once, but he knows he won't be able to resist it again, so he destroys the crystal. Which destroys the fortress. And then, of course, this is where the X-Men all find themselves, back at their home, but in costume still, so I know it wasn't just a dream. And here they are, finding Wolverine kind of standing guard over them. I like that shot, where he's asleep, but with his sword ready. And here we are with Storm, contemplating things, and here's where the X-Men have no way of knowing that they just did humanity a solid, and you get an explanation as to who and what the statues are or once were. And the fortress is in place once more. So yeah, that was X-Men Annual 11, Lost in the Funhouse. So I'm going to give that story 5 out of 5 stars. And if you made it this far with me, thank you very much for going along with the ride. And you like what you see here, feel free to like and subscribe. So, got any questions, comments, drop a line, let me know. I'd love to hear what y'all have to say. So, y'all take care. Have a good day. Bye.